All right, guys. So once again, here today I have Dr. William Bridge, and here today we're going to talk about sleep. And hello across the world, and hello to you, William.
Hey Juan, how's it going, man?
Pretty good, William. Congratulations. I know that you passed or you gained a certificate or something in relation to integrated medicine. Do you want to tell the audience about that?
Sure, man. It's just really it's the completion of 5 year residency training. So basically, graduation from residency in the sense that I can now practice independently in internal medicine and psychiatry. So it was a long road, but that's what's great about medicine is you're forever learning. There's just no more graduations left.
Yeah, and that's pretty cool, William, that it took you, it takes 5 years for you to get for you to be able to practice independently from what you're saying. And that's a big feat. And I really appreciate you coming on this podcast because I know that you have a lot going on with you're getting a new house built, you got your dog, and you got your profession, man. And so you got a lot of things in the work right now. And I really appreciate you for being here and educating the public on sleep. And I know that this is one of your favorite subjects. I know that you've mentioned about talking about this subject for a while. So I'd love to get into it. And just to let the audience know, today we're going to be talking about sleep and all the important functions it has and what it is and why it's important and how to go about it and what are the components involved in the sleep cycle and the stages of sleep. What do you think about that, William? You ready to go?
Yeah. This will be good. I mean, everybody. I'm sure we're going to get into it, but a third of our lives we're supposed to be, spent in sleep. So if we're not, the questions come out of that. So I'm looking forward to getting into this.
So you immediately hit the spot, William, that we spend about a third of our life in sleep, or we're supposed to. And oftentimes we may not reach that 8 hour sleep a day. And that's very telling because when we don't get enough sleep or we don't go through the full stages of the REM sleep cycle, there are many components, physical components as well as mental components that get affected. And that's something I want to get into. But I was hoping that maybe you can share, William, what exactly is sleep? Because I remember a few years ago in my biological psychology class, my professor always stressed that we still don't know the true purpose of sleep. He always stressed that. He always said that there was research showing correlation between physical illnesses or mental components between lack of sleep and mental components and physical components. But he said that researchers still didn't know what exactly the true purpose of sleep was. Do you mind touching upon that a little bit?
Yeah, and I mean, even to this day, there's so many different theories about why we need it and why it's so required. I think the one that I've looked into most that I've really enjoyed reading about. I mean, I think that sleep really is kind of an idle, restorative state that is required to continue functioning at your maximum capacity when you are awake is kind of how I think of it. And the only part of the body that does not have lymphatics, which is basically the waste drainage system of the body, is the head and then the brain. So there's a lot of theories that while we're asleep, there's kind of the cellular waste is exited from our brain cells and actually drained on the surface of the cerebral vasculature. So all that's to say is that if we are not sleeping well, your brain and brain cells do not get to expunge the waste, and that's perceived what could possibly be that fog that you're in that next day where just everything, all your senses are off and you're more irritable. Yeah, it's very likely that's a component of not getting the rest that you need, of course.
And let me get this straight. So if we don't sleep properly, or get enough sleep, then our mind can't almost get drained of, from what I understand, fatty deposits, right? And if it can't get drained, and let me actually ask that question, get a response from you first there. Is
Sure.
that accurate?
So it's not as I mean, there is a cholesterol component to it, but I think that a lot of it is, these the inner workings of each of the brain cells, these organelles within a cell, they're constantly undergoing chemical reactions, and there is going to be byproducts of those that the cell no longer needs. So it needs to do away with it. So there's a theory that there's kind of an expelling and almost a wringing out of the brain like a sponge while we sleep. So those mornings where you wake up and you feel really rested, is a period of good deep sleep, and we'll talk about the different stages. But at that point, you can safely say, well, my mind was really able to get a rest, because the brain and the heart, never turn off. But if you're running the hills and then you lay down, that's your body's rest. But this, being asleep, that's the only way that the brain gets to, I think of it as going on idle.
Oh, okay. And so let me read a couple of my notes here, William. I wrote here that sleep plays an important role in your physical health. And then, for example, and I'm going to put an example here, sleep is involved in the healing and repairing of your heart and blood vessels. And ongoing sleep deficiency is linked to an increased risk of heart disease, kidney disease, high blood pressure, diabetes, and stroke. And I just want to touch on that for a second, even though those are mostly physical components. But if we don't get enough sleep, and you said it's almost our mind, it's almost our brain of detoxing or cleaning itself out, that process helps with that. But if we don't get enough sleep, it affects our blood flow, not only in our body, but in our mind, in our brain. And I don't want to use the word mind and brain interchangeably, because we, on our first podcast, we discussed the difference ever. And if our blood flow isn't working properly, then that affects the way we think. But most of all, that affects our organ system, and the possibility of a stroke, because stroke is when the blood flow stops. And it's all, and from what I understand, William, and that's why I'm so glad that you're on this podcast, because my medical knowledge is limited, and I will admit that. And it's the accumulation of fatty deposits within the within the blood vessels. Is that a good way to put it on how important sleep is and the associations involved if with lack of sleep?
Yeah, so I think of it as, so if you're not sleeping well, your body is the next day is under a state of stress that it otherwise wouldn't be. So you're kind of into this, fight or flight or sympathetic type of action response. And if that happens over time, as a very natural response to stressful information or situations, you will have an increased blood pressure, just as the way the kidneys work to monitor in their response to some of these stress hormones. So over time, if you're forever not getting enough sleep and you're putting yourself at this almost persistent, permanent state of stress, blood pressure will go up, and that's where you kind of get the involvement of the other organ systems, like you talked about, higher blood pressure, cardiac disease, stroke is very possible with uncontrolled blood pressure, one of the highest risk factors. So it basically sleep, and if you're not sleeping, it affects blood pressure, and then blood pressure, it's kind of the all encompassing, can affect every organ system, is how I think of it, to tie it together.
And it's so, once again, I'm so happy you're here. When we're talking about sleep, what is enough sleep and how much sleep is enough, those are all important. But I think it's important for the population to realize, and it stems from what you were saying, William, it's that not having enough sleep, it's not about it being good or bad. it's about the components that are being affected and working together interchangeably that all of a sudden causes some sort of incongruency within the body, and not only physically, but we're talking about mentally as well. So we talked about why sleep is important and what it is. Um, and we're going to touch into the stages of REM sleep, but I wanted to touch in first on how much sleep is good enough sleep, William. And I took some notes here. For
That's what I was going to ask you. So how many hours of sleep do you need?
me, I
Yeah.
have to be honest with myself. I need probably about 8 hours of good sleep. Every time I sleep 8 hours, and let's say I put my phone away, it's 10 o'clock at night. I put my phone away, I'm in bed, and I wake up, let's say at 6 in the morning. I feel like the Hulk. I'm kidding. I don't feel like the Hulk, but I do feel good. I'm ready to go to the gym. I got my stuff. I find myself moving a little bit quicker. I find myself cognitively thinking a little bit faster, more on the spot. Every time, William, I go under 8 hours and significantly under 8 hours, let's say one day I have to do five because I'm sacrificing sleep for some work, like the typical American, right? All of a sudden, I find myself a little bit more irritable. I don't realize it at that moment, but then later on in the day, once the day's done, I'm like, man, today was a little rough day. And then you think of the factor associated with, oh wow, I only got 5 hours of sleep. Maybe that's why I was a little bit moody. Maybe that's why my patience wasn't as high, or maybe that's why I was a little bit slow in doing everything, especially when it comes to paperwork and organization. How about you, William? Because you're a doctor and you told me that you're on call during the middle of the night. Sometimes you get calls in the middle of the night 2 to 3 to 4 times to help make a decision in the hospital. How do you work around your sleep?
So I mean, I pretty much, I can say that over the years, looking back, I've adjusted the amount that I can get in a given amount of time. So I feel like right now for me, 6 hours is sufficient. There with and I've heard other people say this as well. There's a point with me where if I sleep too much, I feel like some of the next day it's kind of hard to get the rust off and get moving. So I think like 5 or 6. If I anything less than 4 is really when I notice I'm not the kind of operating at full capacity. So I think it's important that we talk about this because I always get asked that question by patients, and I think it's important to know that everybody will require a different amount, and you're supposedly supposed to require less sleep the older that you get. You've heard of like neonates and newborns sleeping 16 to 20 hours a day. And technically once you're in your mid 60s and up, you can get away with less than 6 hours. So it does change over time, but I think even if you look at people in their 30s, you'd see great variability about who needs how much sleep and why they feel that way. So there's no clear one answer that it's 7 hours or 7.5. It's pretty patient dependent.
So we tend to put people in a box like this is how much sleep they need to get. This is how much an infant should get. This is how much an adolescent should get proper sleep. But really, you're saying that everyone's a little different, despite us trying to put everyone in a little box. And can that be due because due to the stages of the REM sleep cycle that sometimes it isn't so fixed, as in it takes 120 minutes to go through the 4 to 5 stages? Is that why? Because some people can go through that stage quicker, or that doesn't have anything to do with it?
Well, I think that, it absolutely has something to do with it. And, if you're having an increased, time to get to those deeper stages of sleep, that means overall your duration of your night's sleep is you're going to be spending less time in those restorative stages. So, that's where I think some of the benefit comes in with sleep studies and sleep monitoring, because there's people that because of medications or maybe diet will sleep 8 hours, but they never leave stage 2 or 3 of sleep. or very rarely leave those stages. So they're waking up and they're still exhausted, and that can be medication induced or other medical comorbidities, such as sleep apnea, certain things like that. So there's a huge value in looking into how much a patient is spending in a given stage and their time to cycle through the stages.
So before we get into the stages, and I'm so glad you shared that information, I've I've did my research and I saw that infants and children should, especially infants, they should get around 12 to 16 hours of sleep a day, and children from 1 to 5 should get probably anywhere between 10 to 14 hours of sleep a day, and that's mostly including naps. Don't expect that, don't think, if at least for me, that I don't have a kid, it's about them sleeping 14 hours. No, those are including naps throughout the day, and that's mostly because their brain is like a sponge, and they're introduced to the new world, and all of a sudden they have to assimilate all this information in, and their brain is growing at the same time, and all of a sudden from the moment they're born they're already assimilating information. Their brain has to work hard, so they have to sleep more, and growth is involved, and all these factors. But once we get to probably age 6, it already starts shifting. We only need probably 9 to 12 hours. Obviously, this all depends on an individual basis and what's going on and how much exercise the kid's getting and all these things. And then once we enter the teen years, it's from 8 to 10. Um, this is important, and I like talking about this, William, because many people here in the United States, and I did my research, and I'm gonna find it here somewhere, that we're not getting enough sleep here, especially in the States. And you mentioned earlier before the podcast turned on how sometimes sleep, those in the United States are willing to sacrifice sleep to get things done. And that's part of living in this fast-paced world that we're living in today, partly due to technology. Would you agree with the time cycle that I just put forth when it comes to how much sleep each group should get depending on age?
Yeah, I think that's a very reasonable breakdown, and you see that that kind of trend will continue. The older age group that we're talking about, sleep will or sleep requirement will continue to kind of become less. The more birthdays somebody has. Absolutely, when it comes to the sacrificing of sleep, about a year, maybe a year and a half ago, I read an article about due to like popular request and demand, the one of the subway lines in New York City, they increased the time that it would head into the city at 4 a.m. So, this is the type of work schedule that, in Wall Street or, whatever busy, position that wants you in the office by 5 a.m. because of, time frames elsewhere, things are already awake and going on. So, it just tells you, if people want to get to their job before 5 in the morning, there's going to be some sleep sacrifice going on there.
And something I want to add there, William, is that the way I look at it is, let's say if I'm not sleeping 8 hours a day, I slept 6. Now I'm negative 2 hours. I'm 2 hours in debt of sleep. And if every day during the week I'm only sleeping 6, by the end of the week I'm going to be 14 hours in debt of sleep. I wonder how much, if my body, of course my body adjusts, my mind adjusts, my brain adjusts, but I like to think of it as eventually I'm going to have to make up what I lacked. That debt, I'm going to have to repay it. If I don't, then my brain, my whole body and my brain will adjust, but it's definitely going to affect me. How much? I don't know. But that's the way I tend to want to look at it. And now I wanted to get into the stages of REM sleep because that's very interesting. And so to touch on here, when we were talking about this chart or the research that I did or created or whatnot, then I just wanted to say that that's the important part about the 8 hours of sleep a day, which is 1/3 of our life, is to go through the REM cycle. It's not about sleeping, let's say, 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the afternoon, and 2 hours in the evening, and then 2 hours at night, and that's it. No, because we didn't go through the proper stages of sleep cycle. And that's important because just going through stage 1 through 4, because there's 4 stages of the sleep cycle, going through 1 through 4 takes about 120 minutes. And every time it reverts, it goes back to 1. And each time it reverts, it's almost like we spend more time in a different stage. And so this is the part where I may not be too knowledgeable, but we're going to go into each stage and what it means. And I'll start off with stage 1, William, which is basically just the moment that you put yourself in bed or on the couch and you start closing your eyes, and all of a sudden you're going in between consciousness and unconsciousness. And that process takes about 5 to 15 minutes. And we spend a good portion of the time there, maybe about 5 to 15 minutes, just to go from that consciousness to unconsciousness. And do I have that stage correctly put?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I kind of think of it as like the fancier way is they call it like a alpha relaxation. So your eyes are closed and you're still awake, but there's a point where you kind of transition into like a light traditional sleep that started with drowsiness and kind of the works your way into a deeper sleep as you switch to the next stage.
And the, and in stage 2, it might even be considered like the first real stage, because we spend about 40 to 60% of our sleep cycle in this stage, and there's still no rapid eye movement. That's why they call it non-rapid eye movement. There's still no rapid eye movement, but this is the part where our brain is almost getting ready, right, to start. You know what? I don't want to say getting ready to have dreams, but it's still in the process of sleep, and it's still in the early stages of sleep. Obviously, we talked about when it goes through stage 1, 2, 3, and 4, it reverts back to 1 and it starts over. But sometimes once we pass that first stage, we don't even touch stage 1 anymore. We go straight to stage 2. What happens in this stage 2 of before we get into deep sleep? Because this is still in the early onset, the early process of the sleep cycle. Um,
Yeah, man, I was just going to say that, this seems to be, I think of it because of the time we spent there, it is considered like a stable sleep where it's, in my mind, I think of it as almost like prep work. Because this is where a lot of the chemical processes are going on that makes it difficult or more difficult for us to be woken up. So it kind of turns down, our senses, so to speak. So you're not so sensitive to any external lights, sounds. It really just kind of, make sure everything is teed up as you transition into the third stage. So it's kind of like it's stable and it's preparing you for making sure these next few stages are, as restorative as possible.
so, so even though it's stage 2 out of 4 stages, it's
Mhm.
since we spend the most time there, it is an important. It is considered stable sleep at this point. It's not like the first one where it's like you're going in from consciousness to unconsciousness. Stage 2 is actually considered stable sleep. Okay.
Yes, absolutely.
And once we enter stage 3, um, deep sleep, or it's mostly like we're preparing now to start dreaming, and our brain waves become longer and more, not because the previous one, stage 1 and stage 2, it's almost like our brain waves are very small, and they're very close together. But in stage 3 they become a little bit longer, and it's almost like our brain is not moving so quick at this point, right before going into REM sleep, where it goes back a little shorter. In this stage, we're just preparing for the dream, right? and we spend about, from what I understand here, we spend about 15 to 20% of our sleep cycle here in stage 3. And I'm not sure what exactly, and I'll be honest here with the audience, what exactly happens in this stage 3 of sleep.
This one, I think of here one more so as you've heard the old, parents saying that you have to go to sleep so you can grow. I know this stage is pretty well known for the release of growth hormone. So you do have a physiologic, a body type of response here. So there is believed not only with the growth hormone and how that contributes to height and so on. There's a lot of body rest going on in this stage. So you can get this stage of sleep is a time for if you're having an injury, so a lot of healing. If you've been working out and been really sore, so there's a lot of physical repair going on in this sleep as well. Stage 3. And again,
thanks
sure,
for
go
that
ahead.
one. No, I was going to say thanks for that. And when I meant the slowing of the waves, I should have put it more like heart rate slows, breathing slows, and your heart rate and your breathing levels is typically the lowest point during this sleep cycle, stage 3. And blood pressure falls and body temperatures drops even lower. And it makes sense because you're saying that this is the part where repairing and healing is happening in the sleep cycle. So this stage is very important. But the blood pressure, I just want to let the audience know, it doesn't drop to a dangerous extent. It just drops to the lowest within the sleep cycle. So the last one, though, is REM sleep. And REM sleep is very interesting, William, because we enter this stage about 90 minutes after the first cycle. Remember, one cycle is 1 through 4, guys, 1 through 4. And then we once we reach stage 4, we jump back to 2 and we go 2, 3, 4. And this one takes probably about 120 minutes. So maybe 2 hours. And then it goes, we do it again. And we go through these stages about 4 times, 46 times if we're getting the proper sleep a night. And during the REM sleep, it's very interesting because this is when dreaming happens. And we tend to dream very often throughout the night. Research differs in how much we dream, but we tend to, there's a research here that I was reading by a French scientist that he says we have about 46 dreams a night. And when we get woken up during this stage REM of sleep, when we get woken up, we tend to remember dreams from a little bit from the night before. And when you remember a dream when you just woke up, you probably woke up during the REM stage of sleep. Is that accurate to say, William?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in dreams we could probably do a whole podcast on dreams and what they mean. But what I've seen clinically with some of these patients is that once they start getting whether it's medication or sleep hygiene, and their sleep starts getting tuned up, they'll report that they're having dreams. Like, I don't know about this medicine. I'm having all these vivid dreams, but I think really, I mean, clinically speaking, I think that's starting to point towards them sleeping healthier. Because if you were, if before they started a given medicine, they were only, getting into REM sleep 2 times a night, and they're only sleeping, 3.5, 4 hours a night. It makes sense that they're going to remember less dreams because they're in a dream state, probably about 30% of what they should be. So, I think unless it's a nightmare or it's a dream that is disturbing sleep, it should be looked at almost as like a healthy benchmark of sleep, not a negative thing. And, this is again, in REM, your heart rate, your blood pressure, your breathing, everything kind of amps up a little bit. because to be honest, to dream, it's going to take a little bit more brain power and blood flow, and that's why we see that.
And the stage 4, just so everybody knows, that's the rapid eye movement stage. And actually, the brain waves become a little shorter again because, like you said, William, heart rate, blood pressure picks up again. And that's an important component of the stage 4 of sleep. William, there's so much information involving sleep. And I think just for the sake of the podcast, because there's no way we're going to get through all this information, is for us to go with now talking about the stages. And I put up the slide. I'm going to put up the slide for everybody. Is that what is the proper way, or the different components involved, physical and brain components or mental components involved, that helps you fall asleep and maintain proper sleep? So, William, I don't know if this ever happened to you, but as a kid, I mean, there could be a bunch of noise, the lights can be on, and I'm at a party with my parents, and all of a sudden, I just can't take it anymore. Like, I cannot hold my eyes open anymore. I have to close them and I have to fall asleep, and I'll fall asleep at the guest's house or whatnot. Obviously, I feel safe. There's a safety component there because my parents are there, right? But why does that happen? People may ask, and that's a good question. And I'm going to give you my answer from the research I've done through my education, and then you can tell me yours. But I attribute that to two things, William, two main things. One, melatonin is a neurotransmitter that accumulates as the day goes on. And once the sun goes down, it really starts to kick in. And as melatonin starts to build up in the brain, you're going to become more tired. You're going to become more sleepy. And then that's the first one. And then I'll attribute it to the circadian rhythm, which actually kind of is the biological clock within the brain. And that almost like when we make a schedule, we'll start falling asleep, and we'll go by the circadian rhythm, that biological clock in our head. So if I was used to falling asleep at 10 o'clock, then already when 10 o'clock hits, my circadian rhythm had already been preparing for me to fall at 10 o'clock. And that's probably why it started releasing the melatonin, the neurotransmitter in my mind. And as it builds up, I couldn't hold it at that party as a kid in staying awake. Now we're adults, our brain tends to operate differently. And I'm sure it still has the same component because I tend to fall asleep really early, William. I'm guilty about that. I'm not a big party guy, but when I don't, I start getting really sleepy and I can't operate. So there's so much more information about the circadian rhythm. I'm just simplifying it for the sake of time for this podcast. But do you mind shedding some light on this process? And has that ever happened to you where you're somewhere, you cannot fall asleep, there's people around, it's a social situation, you're working, or you have to finish up a report, but you can't hold it, and you have to try and do something about it, and it's really, oh, come on, circadian rhythm, let's get this going, I need to finish this. Does that ever happen to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you're in a sleep routine, and for the last 3 weeks you've been in bed by 8, asleep by 8:30, and then all of a sudden you're at a social gathering and you're still up, or having to be up by 9:30, 10 o'clock, you're still awake. Your body's kind of in a state of turmoil because for the last 3 weeks you had been asleep at that time. So absolutely, I think that the body has magnificent ways of telling you enough is enough, and that's in all areas. But I think on the side of a melatonin, it is a neurotransmitter. It's collected and accumulated throughout the course of the day, but its peak release is basically when the sun starts to set. So the light receptors in the eye actually notice the change of light in the sky as the sun starts to set. So that's when I tell patients that you should take your melatonin. So if you just have an app on your phone and you see, okay, the sun sets at this time, that's around the time you should actually dose the melatonin. If you're taking melatonin like an hour before bed, it's not going to be physiologically representative how it would be if you're taking it when the sun starts to. So that peak, the reason melatonin works, is, you know, if you take it and help out that peak melatonin release when the sun starts to set, by, you know, the next 2.5, 3 hours, it'll be like a gradual further accumulation. So it's almost like a boost to a normal physiologic process. So a lot of people don't know that, and
No,
they're taking their melatonins on their nightstand, and they take it 15 minutes before sleep. I mean, it's not to say that it won't work. They will just not be getting the potential out of that given milligram. And, you know, and that's how these patients end up on 10 milligrams of melatonin. And in my experience, after 5, I don't see it help too much, but that's kind of plus minus.
and wow, man, honestly, William, I didn't know that, and I'm glad that you shared that information with me. I mean, but and with the audience, to be honest, and I didn't know that. And sometimes I'll have patients saying that they're having trouble falling asleep, and I'll recommend for the parents, right, to, because I work with adolescents, to maybe buy about 3 milligrams of melatonin and just give it to them maybe an hour before bedtime. And that's probably not, you know, an hour and a half before bedtime, and that probably is not the best idea. That tends to be the way everyone uses melatonin, but that's not the best idea. You're saying that the moment the sun starts to go down, depending on, you know, the time change or whatnot, it's,
Yeah.
that you're going to maximize your body is and brain is going to maximize the 3 milligrams of melatonin you took, and it'll be better physiologically if it's, because it'll be a gradual process, and it'll create more melatonin in your mind, so you'll get tired and you'll fall asleep, and it'll be just healthier all around, instead of right before bed just popping a 10 milligram melatonin. And yeah, it'll work a little bit, but there's a lot of side effects to it as well. You might even wake up tired. But I have a question now, and it's okay. I mean, I'm asking you a lot of questions, William, because I learned a lot from you, and that's why I really appreciate you on this podcast. But let's say someone takes a nap in the middle of the day, right? I read online on research, because I'm always reading research and stuff, that our ancestors used to take naps in the middle of the day because it was too hot to do anything. So I'm not, you know, obviously that depends on what part of the world, you know, that you're in and stuff. But that's why sometimes in the middle of the day after lunch, we'll get a little tired, because or in our body, like, from our, let's say, genetic history, we want to take a little nap in the middle of the day. But from what I understand, there's no melatonin that's being released at that time. So why is it that sometimes, even if we had a proper night's sleep, and it's not the time when the sun's going down, that our melatonin's, you know, starting to take up, the neurotransmitters starting to accumulate, why is it that we want to fall asleep at that time, or we have an urge?
You know, and in those instances, I think it kind of, you know, draws back to what you were talking about when you fall behind overall. So,
Oh,
you know, you had a good night's sleep the night before, you might be, you know, still for that certain week, 4 hours behind. So I think that, you know, that's part of it. And I would also say that it seems to be a little bit, you know, physically demanding. You know, the sleep at night after a long day, you're kind of like, you know, my brain is just exhausted. But anytime I, you know, see patients, you know, tending to want to sleep more during the day, I see it more in those with, you know, jobs that are physically more intensive, or an exercise routine. So there's something about the physical rest that can be, you know, kind of motivated by you know, midday nap. But I think anything over 20 minutes can negatively affect your ability to initiate sleep that evening. So try to, you know, limit it to that. But ideally, no naps are better.
yeah, and I really appreciate you having on. I just want to touch on one last thing, William, before, you know, we end the podcast, and we continue a second episode in the near future. when someone's not sleeping properly, as a mental health clinician, I always try and look at their lifestyle and what's happening right before they're falling asleep. What are they doing? What's their day like? And all these factors contribute, because there's a lot of research that about 30 minutes a day of exercise can help with the sleep process later at night. For example, as long as you're not exercising right before sleep, you know. Um, Another example is, if you're messing, or not you, per se, William, but if someone's messing with electronics and these bright screens like we are right now on this computer, on the iPad, on the phone, or you're there scrolling or looking at different, at least me, research articles, but I can see how someone else is doing other things, and you're there just doing that, then all of a sudden your mind is getting hit with this light that's very bright, and these screens tend to stem off like a bright blue light. That'll change the way the brain is working, especially the circadian rhythm. So I always tend to look at the lifestyle they're living and what they're doing right before going to bed. And maybe if someone says, "Oh, I live a perfectly healthy life and I exercise, but I'm exercising an hour before going to sleep," that's probably not the best thing, because with the moment that you exercise, it's almost like you're resetting the circadian rhythm and you're giving it different messages than what's really going on right now. And this is like an unconscious process. It's not like we have full control. I mean, we can be conscious of what we're doing and how it's going to affect our brain, but we don't have a direct control of what our brain, how it's operating. So um, if that's me as a mental health clinician, it's always, when it comes to helping those that are struggling with sleeping, and obviously there's more intense cases that we didn't get into clinical diagnosis, but what's the lifestyle that they're living and what are you doing right before going to sleep? Do you have anything to add to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think just kind of touching on the sleep hygiene side of things, I think that, there's definitely like a list of things that I run through before, we try to, go to prescription or over the counter, treatments. I think that the first thing I ask about, especially nowadays in society, is caffeine intake. So a lot of people don't realize the we call it half-life of caffeine. So if you get, let's say you have a drink, Starbucks coffee that has 200 milligrams of caffeine in it. So the half-life of caffeine is 8.5 hours. So that means that if you have a coffee, 200 milligrams at 9 a.m., it'll take 8.5 hours of your day to cut that 200 milligrams down to 100. Then you're looking at another 8 hours before you go from 100 to 50. So I tell patients, like, everything to not have a caffeinated drink after 9 a.m. I mean, none is better, but it's just not going to happen. So definitely caffeine and everything with caffeine in it. So it's the coffees, the teas, the chocolates, etc. So that's part of it. Definitely, I think fluid intake is more so for your older patients, but it could be younger patients. If you're downing a bunch of fluids right before you go to sleep, your body has this sensation of having to wake up to go to the bathroom. So that could be a simple fix that people don't realize that they're doing. I think sleep schedule is important. I tell patients, even on the weekends when you're off, you should be getting up at the same time. So going to bed at the same time, waking up at the same time is very important. And talking to them about their alarm clock and how they wake up. Do they hit sleep 15 times or not? These are like very detailed things that can, if you fix it, it can prevent a medication. And I think the other part of it is definitely kind of taking a look at those external influences. So like you said, is there music playing? Is the TV on? Are they on their phone? Scrolling through the Psych Life Instagram? You know, so I think that that's also part of it. I mean, pets in the bed is part of it as well. I mean, he's very, does the partner snore is another. I mean, these are things that, you know, most providers don't know to ask, but I see a lot of patients with sleep problems. And also, you know, it's in the same ballpark with caffeine, but alcohol, tobacco, both not a good idea before sleep and really in general.
Man, William, like you really took my answer and like you amplified it by by like at least 10 times. And that's why I appreciate you so much, because here I am talking
Sure.
about lifestyle. What are you doing before sleep and how you're affecting the circadian rhythm? But I leave off little components such as, and great research that you're talking about, such as caffeine intake and the lifespan and how it takes 8 hours for it to go half. And
Yeah.
and those that are drinking about 3 to 4 cups of coffee a day, right, throughout the day, just to get by the day. Yeah, I had someone tell me, oh, it increases my sexual arousal when I have about cups of coffee a day, and it's true. The research shows that, but you're
Yeah.
also affecting the way you're sleeping, and you're affecting the way that your brain is operating, and how much caffeine is too much, and alcohol and sugar, and obviously as a substance use counselor, I guess I didn't even mention it because it's almost like so much part of the process. But wow, yeah, you gave some great stuff there. In the fluid intake, I've struggled with that before, because sometimes the more I work out, the more I want to drink water. And I do find myself maybe once or twice throughout the night getting up to use the restroom, and that's a sign that I'm drinking way too much water. And if that affects my stages of sleep and the cycle, then it's definitely going to affect me for the next day. I just may not notice it directly how it's affecting me, but there's definitely a cause and effect there. So, William, I want to thank you so much for being on this podcast. I appreciate you. I'm sure the audience very much appreciates you. I love collaborating with you. I've never met your dog, but I love him as well, man, because I know he keeps you company over there, and I
Sure.
hope that everything goes good within the next couple of weeks with your board. Congratulations on your 5 years and you being able to practice independently, and I hope everything goes well. I know you got a lot going on there at the same time, man, and we're gonna talk very soon, okay?
All right. Thanks a lot, man. I appreciate it. This was a good one, and I think definitely there's more to touch on with sleep, so we'll have to plan that down the road.
Thanks, William, and take care, everybody, and thanks everybody for listening.